knowledge. I don't know about that, but you will have to listen to me. So just a few words about OIDEL before to start. So you have also, so OIDEL was created in 1985, basically by a group of 40 political personalities, with the idea that educational pluralism was not a granted thing, and they thought like maybe it was about time to create a civil society organization to advocate for educational pluralism, for parental rights. We have consultative status before the United Nations, UNESCO, the European Council. Also, we are really active at the European Union. As I was saying, we are a non-profit organization, and our main aim is to whenever there is a discussion on education, bring a plural perspective, bring the perspective of parents and also bring the perspective of non-governmental schools, even though also we have been involved in other sort of debates. And what I'm going to talk today with you is how the education discussions at the national level have switched it from a quantitative perspective to a qualitative perspective, and how this have had an impact on, and also how this educational pluralism, because of this change from quantitative to quality discussions, it has reshaped also the discussions on educational pluralism. Some of the things you are going to hear, I was planning to say, have been said, so maybe I'm going to skip it, and or I'm going to say them just shorter, so we can have a longer discussion. But yeah, that would be my main goal. So basically, the first interesting thing I would like to share with you. In 2022, UNESCO made a document called Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract. As you know, UNESCO is the special agency of the United Nations on education, and they set up an international commission on the future of education. They put a group together that they receive contributions for 1 year for experts all around the world. We ourselves, OIDEL, we send some of the contributions with the idea to catalyze the global debate on what education needs for the future in regards of the new challenges, like the new complexities, the new uncertainties, the new fragilities. And there are some really good news on this report, and that's the first thing I wanted to do. So the current situation of the world, it says like in terms of access to education, this has increased all over the regions since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in '46 was released. Like for instance, in 1946 there was 2.4 billion in the world, and 45% of those population have set a foot in the school. Today we have 8 billion, so from 2.4 to 8 billion, and over 95% of the worldwide population have put their foot in the school at one point. Enrollment in 2020 has surpassed 90% in primary, 85% in lower secondary, 60% in upper secondary school. There is an expansion, and also what they were saying is like in 2022, what they were saying is like the trends are positive in terms of accessibility. Another data, for instance, while more than 1 in 4 children were out of primary education in 1970, the share in 2020 dropped to less than 10%. Also, in terms of gender disparities, the news of that report are quite good. It says, again, just to give you some data, improvements, and I'm quoting from the report, improvements have been most evident for girls who comprise almost 2/3 of children out of school in 1990. With near gender parity achieved globally in primary education, girls are no longer disproportionately represented in out of the school population, except in the lowest income countries in Africa. The same we can say about pre-primary education. The trends are positive all over the world, and also this is having a good impact on the access to education later in primary education. Literacy rates, also we are in a really good moment. Among the poorest countries, have never been closer to the levels of the richest countries. Youth literacy rates in lower middle and middle income countries have now converged with those observed in the upper middle. So also in literacy rates, also the trends are really positive. And the access to higher education has never been higher in history. Global participation rose from 10% of youth and adults worldwide in 1970 to today to 40%. And in Western countries, there is more, the gender disparity here reached to a point that there is more women having access to higher education than men. Indeed, there is still challenges, because we are not saying that 100% of children have access to education, but the tendencies are positive. And indeed, this report was made before the war in Ukraine. It was made after, while COVID was happening. But there is ground to be positive. But there is an important change here in this report. There has been a change on the challenges of education from a how perspective, from a how many perspective to a how perspective, from a quantitative perspective to a quality perspective. Like for a long time, the biggest concern of the international community was to make sure that children could reach, children could have access to education, to finish illiteracy. And still it's a challenge, but it feels like this could be achieved maybe by 2030 in most of the regions. So we get into the second, to a new paradigm of the discussions, a quality paradigm, in which we wonder the how, how are we providing education? A good example of that are the Sustainable Development Goals. Previous to that, there was the Millennium Goals, that they were focused a lot on accessibility to education for poorest countries. Instead, today, what we are talking is about, well, it says, I'm just going to read it, ensure inclusive, equitable, quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So what we are talking here is about quality, we are talking about inclusivity, we are talking about lifelong learning and equitable. And also to give you some vibes on what we are focusing today, we care that education is not just having kids in a room, but that education is relevant. We care that this education, that the form and the substance of education, including the curricula, including the teaching methods, can be acceptable for all the communities. And also we are acknowledging that we live in a really rapidly changing world, and therefore education cannot be limited to the first stages of life. So it can be adapted to, people can receive instruction through all their life, no? This very report I was mentioning from UNESCO, Reimagining Our Futures Together, underlines two big educational challenges. First is ensure quality of education for all children, and ensure that education becomes a useful tool for sustainable future for the world community. So again, what we see here is that in 2022, when these experts were put together and they were asked about what should be the next challenge, they were asking questions, more qualitative questions on how are we providing education. So what I'm going to do now is like how pluralism can be an interesting tool to rethink that. No, how pluralism has shaped and has an influence of these qualitative discussions. One thing that this Reimagining Our Futures Together document says on this regard, it talks a lot about the problems that assimilation has had in education. And I'm quoting here, it says, historically, education has been used to violate the cultural and religious rights of children, for example, as a vehicle of assimilation. And this is a clear example of forgetting one quality feature of education that can lead, in fact, to an instrumentalization of education as something that is not a human right, and show us the importance of pluralism to holistically consider the quality dimension. So, to start this discussion, I want to start talking about what is the main aim of the right to education, which is something that Alejandro have addressed before. So, what is the main aim of the right to education? This is a topic that we deal in many countries. We say, the aim of education is inclusion, or the aim of education is, you name it, global citizenship, equal opportunities, and all these things are good. But from a human rights perspective, the main aim of the right to education is the full development of human personality. That appears in the Human Declaration of Human Rights, that appears in all the Universal Covenants on Human Rights, and that appears in most of the constitutions in the Western world, at least. But I'm not saying it does not appear in other constitutions, just like I'm more familiar with the Western world. As I was saying yesterday, if we have this aim for the right to education, it's because when they were drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Jewish Council say like Germany had a system that was perfectly efficient, everybody have access, the level of education was good, yet it has enabled this monstrosity, Nazism. So it has to have a humanistic approach. So education, the first aim is to enable the full development of human personality. Personality which doesn't mean children to become really charismatic or have a really fun personality, but to develop as a person. And what is a person? And this is also an interesting part. Person is not an individual. We could say like the full development of the individual, but person is, you know, it comes from the Greek, is the mask of an actor is to develop who we are, to understand our singularity within a community. And the discussion of what is a person has led also to, I think, two big schools on how this human personality can be developed. The first one, and this also has shaped a lot of discussions. So I'm going to talk about the two schools that are talking about what does it mean, the full development of human personality. So the first approach will be the holistic liberal approach, and then the second one will be the cultural approach, which is more close to what the international instruments are saying. So the holistic liberal approach, we could mention here two authors maybe that have been really influential. The first one would be, the first aim of the holistic liberal approach is to achieve the full autonomy of the human being. One author, maybe one of the main authors of that would be John Dewey, the American philosopher, who emphasized that children's autonomy should be the main aim. He was really worried about parents because he says parents, you know, they will try to impose a cosmovision, and children in their educational stages, they should be exposed to different cosmovisions so they will be able to choose who they want to be. More recently, I would say one author that has wrote a lot about that is the American philosopher Amy Goodman, that now is the ambassador of the US in Germany, who states that one of the main aims of the right to education is to guarantee the autonomy of citizens through rational deliberation between lifestyles. So somehow the aim of this approach is raising a sort of ruthless child in which they force them to be free, as this is the expression they use. They submit him to different cosmovisions. So once he's an adult, he can choose who he wants to be. So that's really, I mean, like somehow as if he was a consumer in a supermarket of cosmovisions, you know, and he can choose what he wants to do. What are the problems with that? What are the problems with this vision? First is the problem, like if autonomy is the first goal, the most likely thing is like the cosmovisions that put autonomy in the top of moral value will be probably more privileged than those that doesn't. This is a critique that has been really developed for an author, an American author called Rita Coggenson. And the second one is that it brings a lot of mistrust towards communities and parents and civil society. You know, like any sort of community that you're trying to pass a cosmovision, there will be a lot of mistrust, and which can be dangerous also for a democracy, like putting mistrust on families, communities, and civil society organizations. So, and then now what I'm going to do is developing a little bit this cultural approach, you know, because there is one big part that this liberal, holistic approach is missing, which is that the human beings, the full development of human beings indeed depends on skills and passions, but we are forgetting that we are who we are because of our cultural surroundings, and we are part of a family, we are part of a community, we are part of a city, in a concrete time, in a concrete space. So let's talk about a little bit about what is culture, no? Because I think a big part of this discussion is it culture a cage? Well, culture can be perceived as a cage because it gives meaning to concrete behaviors. It puts weight to different ways we behave. It puts significance to things. But culture is essential for the human beings. It is by knowing who we are that we can act freely. And culture in some way is a compass that puts some senses in our freedom. Like we are not free in the middle of nowhere. We are free in a concrete society, and like we are at the end, freedom is choosing between what is good and what is bad, what is beauty and what is not beauty, and there is a big exercise here, and this happened within a concrete culture. From anthropological perspective, there is an interesting part here. I don't know if you ever experienced a child who has been raised out of a human culture. What happens to him? He behaves like an animal. Like, well, there are some experience of children that have been, for an accident or for things, they've been raised in a jungle, or they've been raised in the forest, and usually with the children, what they happen is, like, because they haven't had the social and cultural surroundings, they behave like an animal. This does not happen, for instance, when an animal is raised within a human community. He continues raising as an animal. So this is an important part of who we are. It also is our cultural surroundings. And that shows us that the human being is not just an individual, or as Greeks would say, an item, but also it's a social being. The idea also of the cage is like when sometimes also we see the idea of culture, like this idea that we have to learn something before. Owning a culture enables us to be free, and I'm going to put you two examples of that. Picasso, he owns all the current arts at the time, and because he owns it and he knew everything that was happening, he masters all sorts of, he could later have this freedom of saying, I'm just going to change the history of arts. The same goes for a little bit, have you seen Karate Kid? Classical movie, yeah?
It's a classic.
Yeah? So if you've seen Karate Kid, the kid is really mad at one point because he's like, okay, why do I have to watch the car? This guy is taking advantage of me. And basically what he's teaching him is some automatisms, so later he can own the freedom of movement in a fight. So culture there is a lot of that sometimes. So you can say, Ignasi, that's great. This really worked for your speech, but is it your thing or someone else is saying that? Well, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 27 also puts a lot of weight on culture, and it says everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community. Moreover, the UNESCO Declaration on Cultural Diversity says culture takes diverse forms across time and space. The diversity is embodied in the uniqueness and pluralities of identities of the groups and societies making up humankind. So culture, the founders of the Human Rights Declaration on Human Rights already realized of the importance of culture for the dignity of the human being. Mounier, who was one of the main philosophers, was part of the Philosophers' Committee in the realization of the document that later led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, defined like the human being is an inside that needs an outside. And Patrice Meillarich, who is a philosopher here in Geneva that has talked a lot about this issue, say like the idea of an identity, like at the end, identity, like what is it, identity? It says it's the interface between personality and character. And it says it's not a withdrawal or retreat, but it's our face in front of another person. So we need culture in order to have an identity, so we have a face when we met someone else. What happens when we don't have that? So Nuccio Ordine, are you familiar with Nuccio Ordine, this Italian professor? Nuccio Ordine is an Italian professor, I think he's from southern Italy, I can't remember but he says, many times in education today, we focus on just the professional part, the skills. And this is impoverishing a big part of education. And we see that already, because when we ask someone who you are, they say, I'm an architect, I'm a lawyer. You define yourself for your job. While we are way more than the job. So this is also showing part that in education, we have to enrich human nature by getting to know our culture. And again, just to finish and to prove like I'm not just making things up here, UNESCO in 1972 and later in 2022, they acknowledge that one of the main dimensions of the right to education is learning to be. So education is not just about becoming a good professional, it's about also learning to be. And most recently, just 2 years ago, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, so the main independent expert of the United Nations, did a report on the cultural dimensions of the right to education, also recalling the importance that education cannot forget about this dimension of identity, and helping human beings to get to know who they are. So, we know at this point that the challenge of education of the future have a qualitative dimension, and we realize that a qualitative dimension needs something that goes beyond the skills and goes a lot in line with the idea of culture, so we can develop a human personality. So, how can we think, how can be this put in place in practice? So two realities that are happening, I think that all of us, we can acknowledge is the world is becoming more and more globalized, and also that societies are more plural and becoming more plural. And this should not be a bad thing, but this is just something that is happening, and we have to acknowledge, and we have to see how the right to education is put in exercise in a more global and more plural society. The Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which is the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights is the one who interprets the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, says that education has to be accessible, available, but also puts two notions that give us clues on how to make all that we were saying in place. It has to be also acceptable and adaptable. So by acceptable, what it means is like all education has to be culturally relevant for children, and it even mentions like hearing also what the parents have to say in this regard. And adaptable also means like all education has to adapt to the needs of the children on a concrete context. So maybe teaching, I don't know, Greek philosophy in certain parts of the world, you could be perceived like, I don't know at what point this is adaptable, and the other way around. Like, so I think maybe people in indigenous communities need to know like who we are, why do we speak this language, what is our history. So education has to be also adaptable. But this seems pretty complicated in an increasing plural world, right? Because it's hard to find agreements. Like in the city of Geneva, we can think about that with such a big migrant community. How are we agreeing on these sort of things? Especially this could be difficult in a unitary system, like in a system that fits all citizens. This could be a big challenge. So the problem with the state-run school, with only having a state-run school system, first one is how are we choosing what are we putting in the curriculum or not? So even though they have to do the exercise of to be neutral, also we have to acknowledge that at some point our societies need a more pluralistic system. Some people say that, well, this could be solved through neutrality. But neutrality, one of the problems of neutrality, as Charles Taylor said, that often hides the implicit endorsement of hegemonic culture being discriminatory towards a minority. And here we can think maybe about these people from Ticino that wanted the voucher. They say, well, it's only 30%. Well, but they are always there, and they feel like they cannot choose. The same goes for Clemenceau in the 19th century, in which cannot be was saying like, well, education needs to say things. You know, like education is a moral exercise, and at one point we need to say things, and we need to like you cannot be neutral in many issues. And for instance, he was saying when we're talking about Tiberius or when we are talking about Jesus, that there is not a neutral answer to that. Who is Jesus? Like, you cannot say, okay, we are just going to provide a neutral answer. No, at one point some people will feel, no, you are not providing a neutral answer. So it seems like we need a pluralistic system. So how are we building a pluralistic system? I think here we have already an answer from the human rights instrument that has been seen before, which is the figure of parents. No, like parents are really present in all the covenants concerning education. Universal Declaration in Article 26.3 says parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. In the same line, the Convention on the Rights of the Child points parents, or as the case may be legal guardians, have the primary responsibility for upbringing and development of the child. So children, the family is an interesting institution because in this regard, because many of the social challenges that the child has, they are shared with the family. So for instance, that's why we gave them this responsibility. For instance, when we have children who is dealing with problems such as belonging to a minority, most likely he's going to share that with his family. I can imagine, it's really hard for me to imagine a child belonging to a national minority that doesn't share that with his family. The same goes with ethnicity, the same goes with religion. So family can be a mediator between the identity, the child, and the community in the field of education. One interesting thing that the Covenant says, and many people say like, well, children do not belong to the family, and that's really true, that parents are the responsible. So the way the human rights mechanisms have built the idea of families is like, well, as the state cannot have an answer for all the children, we are going to make parents responsible, so they choose the education they want for their kids. Of course, they also have to grant the same way they have to grant feeding, they have to grant certain standards, and because of that, they are responsible, therefore they have obligations, but also they have rights. And one of these rights would be to choose at certain level the sort of education they want for their children. That does not mean that family has unlimited powers, neither they should not be an excuse to avoid direct contact by public authorities with the leaders of the community or any sort, but it means like families in this, when we're talking about pluralism and when we're thinking how can we deal with the issues concerning qualitative debates, seems that they should play again an important role. More important also because as we were saying, we live in a plural world, and an increasing plural world, and in a more global world. And as we all know, identities are flexible and are mutable. And some people have said, why don't we hear communities instead of families? Well, maybe because of this flexibility, right? Because when we talk about communities, the communities have, especially community leaders, have the tendency to crystallize what their community is. So they say, we are these rules, we have this language, but reality is more complex than that. And a family is the combination of two worlds many times. You know, like many families have one partner who is religious, the other is not religious. One speaks one language, the other one doesn't speak that language. One is migrant, the other one is not. Even a family, one interesting thing that is harder that it happens within a community, it's most likely to switch their cosmovision. So, you know, you can have a family who was really religious and then they become more secularized, or the other way around, or family who vote for certain options and at one point they decide to vote different options. So family responds better to the dialogue there is between a community and this sort of flexibility. Also, well, I mean, yeah, so I think it's important in this regard to give some room for families so they can choose the education they want for their children, to go back to trust. Also, I think an important part of democracy is trusting our citizens. And a democracy that does not trust citizens to educate their children, there is, I think, something rooted there that also requires some reflection. And I'm finishing already, but I wanted to address an important point that has been mentioned before, which is the intercultural dialogue. You know, sometimes it feels like educational pluralism can be used as an excuse to avoid intercultural dialogue. Or as an excuse, like, I don't want my kids to participate on that, so I'm putting them out. No, I put them in my own institution. And I think this is a really valid concern, and especially taking into account that also from a human rights perspective, one of the aims of education is to promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial and religious groups. But at the same time, I think there is something incomplete on the way we have been addressing intercultural dialogue. Because today, when we think about intercultural dialogue, it's like, let's put different people together and let's make it happen. You know, like let's put different kids together in a room, and eventually, you know, they will be friends. You know. When we do things, I mean, it's hard for me to see evidence in which this works, especially for minorities. Like when there is a guy belonging to a minority and going to discussion without any sort of preconditions, most likely he's going to be eaten by the hegemonic culture. And we've been working with some indigenous people, for instance, and we have seen that, especially when they are So our identity and hierarchy of values is a dynamic reality, and it's true that we need also this sort of intercultural dialogues. But in order we can, one of the things of the intercultural dialogue is not just being together, it's also so we can negotiate, we can know what we have in common and what we don't have in common, the beauty in the other, the beauty in ourselves, the beauty we have in common. and also what we don't have in common. And also there is this part of negotiation, but if we don't know who we are, how are we going to engage in intercultural dialogue? So again, like here, we see again one of the importance of educational pluralism. Children need to know who they are before engaging in these sort of things, because also, well, we can go later on that, but I mean, there is also some traumatic experience of going into these things without any preconditions. So what would be the 3 preconditions for intercultural dialogue? First, we need to know the common norms we have. I mean, because I think also there is, within the pluralism, for intercultural dialogue, but also for a pluralistic system, we need to know at least what do we have in common, what are the common rules that enable us to live together. Second thing is, it has to allow all citizens to get to know who they are. So people should know who they are before going into this place. And second, allowing the spaces for that. I think like we are talking a lot about intercultural dialogue, but we feel like, okay, if intercultural dialogue sometimes is just putting different citizens in maths class together without really a strategy, but maybe we had to start thinking about allowing some spaces for children and adults belonging to different groups so they can meet and discuss and even mediated by someone in a more fair perspective. Educational pluralism, as I was saying, is not an excuse, it cannot be an excuse to prevent minors from knowing other cultural contexts, but to allow them access to this context with the possibility of discussing and negotiating this on equal footing. So I'm finishing already. I know this is complicated, everything I'm saying. Indeed, we do not have these sort of spaces in general terms. We don't have even funding for this sort of alternative. But at the time, many schools did not have computers either, and today they do. Or the certain things that we take for granted that we have to learn, they were not for granted a few years ago. And we are not here to I think if we are here in this sort of training today, it's not to think about what we have, but to think education for the future also. So that's why I wanted to send these ideas also to think, how can we do that? And future can be scary, maybe today more than a few years ago. The future is definitely uncertain. But despite all that, it's our obligation to try to shape a future in which we can achieve a full realization of the right to education for all, and also for the children belonging to the mainstream groups. And today we are in Geneva, and I want to recall one of the sentences of Eleanor Roosevelt in this regard, that future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams. End of quote. A full realization of the right to education requires a notion of quality education in which all cultural groups should have some room. Historically, whoever wants a war, whoever owns the power, whoever owns the cultural hegemony, could impose his views on the others, on the rest of the society. Today we are here talking about the beauty of allowing people who think differently than ourselves to have a chance to teach their children who they are. It hasn't been historically the case, but if we also want to think education for the future, I think we have to think also for these groups. It's not easy, but it's worth trying, I think. Thank you.